Thanks for your time today. I wanted to quickly chat about learning analytics and this strange field that's been kind of going on, bubbling in the background for about 10 years now, but hasn't really yielded any tangible outcomes for teachers or learners or anybody really. Don't let them hear that I say that. I told you that. But what I guess I wanted to share today is some ideas around what the learning analytics is, the challenges that we face globally as a field, and then how to connect this to the work that you all do as librarians and people who work in and around libraries. So I guess to start us off, I wanted to talk about, let me just move a few things around on my screen. I wanted to talk about what exactly is learning analytics, and the traditional definition that everyone uses is basically this one on the screen now. It's really around getting data in, collecting it, measuring it, analyzing, reporting it, and then using it presumably to understand and then also improve or optimize learning and the environments where learning occurs. And so there are a lot of different, I guess, purposes of learning analytics. And so one of the purposes of learning analytics is around understanding. And typically here, I'm just going to type as I speak, which could be a bit risky, is around understanding. And so typically here you have ideas around dashboards and those kind of things coming out. And so it's kind of ideas around your organization is sitting on data. Let's present the data or visualize it in a way which people can actually use to get a bit more understanding around what's happening. There's also a lot around prediction. And around prediction, it's kind of like the idea that because we have this data here, let's not just go about visualizing it, but also go around thinking about how we can predict how students or our learners are going to behave or how they're going to perform. And so it's kind of like the whole Amazon idea, you know, because you bought these two items, it means that you may be interested in this other item. Because you operated in the library in this particular way, or you did this thing in the classroom, this means that you could be doing this next thing. Other purposes around it could include things like personalized feedback and support. And so the idea is around finally involving the teacher or the educator in this process and actually thinking about how they use data to essentially personalize that resources and support and information that goes back to students. Now, in terms of data sources, learning analytics typically relies on a different range of things, mainly depending on what the institution or the organization has available to it. And so learning analytics traditionally has been very higher education focused. And so in the higher education field, you have things like something called the SIS, the Student Information System. You have things called the LMS, the Learning Management System. You have things like publisher platforms. You have things like other video platforms. You have student evaluation data. And now what people are starting to do more of is thinking about the kind of other interactions and touch points students have with the organization. And so a lot of people now are keying into key library data, for example. Creepily, some of them are starting to step into the realms of Wi-Fi data and the things that can tell us about students, and also social media data as well, and it gets kind of increasingly creepy as you go further down that list. And we can have a discussion about ethics soon as well. So with all these data sources, what people try to do in learning analytics is try to kind of put them into one data warehouse, so to speak, in order to try and understand and improve how learners learn. So across here on the right, we have ideas around basically challenges that we have going in learning analytics. And a lot of it is around the data is in lots of different places, and it's really hard to collect it in one place. And so silos of data, you may have library data sitting in one database, you have learning management system data sitting in a different place, you have Wi-Fi data sitting in a different database, and it's really hard to actually connect those ideas together. Educators at the coalface of teaching learners, they also have a lot of issues around actually getting access to the right infrastructure and the right tools in order to do this. Data is a very foreign concept to a lot of people, and using data in the right way is also quite tricky. There's also a lot of issues around bias and bucketing. And what I mean by this is learning analytics in the traditional sense tries to use algorithms to ostensibly understand students. But in order to do this, they have to make some assumptions about the data and the students and the learners underlying it. And so it's kind of like if you imagine Amazon, again, Amazon's predictive shopping service. It's because you bought these two items, it means that you must be interested in the third, or because you viewed these items, it must be interested in this. But what those algorithms fail to do is they fail to truly understand you as the person, or the student or the learner as a person. And so there's a lot of algorithmic bias that creeps into these predictive algorithms, which is a bit of a problem. To do with this, also privacy and ethics, there's I guess a concept of beneficence in learning analytics, which basically says that just like in medical fields, we want to do no harm to our learners. And also we want to make sure that the data is captured in a way which is only used for the purposes which they've approved. And so there's a really big, I guess, ideas around privacy and ethics, which is really important. And finally, because of a lot of these things, because we can't get to the data, because we don't have the right tools for the data, because the data or the algorithms don't really do the right things for us, and because we have concerns about privacy and ethics around it, the uptake actually at the coalface with instructors has been really low over the past 10 years. And this is something that the learning analytics field is challenged by globally in terms of how do we actually get people to benefit from this? How do we get teachers and also students to benefit from this? So in terms of how we consider the connection between libraries and LA, these questions I want to just hang here for a little bit, because we need to consider, in terms of your role as librarians, who are our learners and how do they seek success? What role do we all play then in achieving this success? And then how can we get data at the right times and right places about these interactions, which could then finally actually inform what we do to promote learning success a bit more. And so I think when we think about libraries and learning analytics, these are probably the key questions. It's thinking through how do we use data, or the right data in the right way, and what would this data be in order to then improve the services and the education that we're rendering to our learners. Some of the opportunities I think that I see in terms of libraries and LA around these four things. And so we've heard today I was able to pop into a few things today about applied research, and so there's a lot of potential for working with other library stakeholders on applied research, and also this idea of using this to kind of prove or continue to prove our evidence of impact as libraries. And you'd be surprised, but there's actually a lot of untapped data sources that, at least in higher education, academics would like to get out of libraries and student interaction with libraries. And so there's a big opportunity here in terms of drawing from these untapped sources from the library. So with that, that's my 7 minutes up. So I'll hand back to Marianne.
Thanks so much, Danny. And thank you to all the panelists. I can see that we're already running quite a few questions in here. We'll give people time to think about Danny's presentation first, and I'll go back to the ones from, where are we? From Nathan. So Nathan, there's a question from Jelena. Do you think that having Indigenous academic officers and teachers increases the Indigenous students? I guess that means the numbers of Indigenous students.
Yeah, yeah, 100% do. And I've noticed in places, once they lose Indigenous staff, and I'm not just talking about, I think this is true in academia, but I also think it's true in libraries and museums. I think having Aboriginal staff does bring in Aboriginal community members. Recently, I got asked to help curate something at a venue out in Penrith, and they were asking because they were trying to curate, they were trying to engage different curators to get different community members to this venue, because they just don't get, they weren't getting many of their local Aboriginal population, but they also weren't getting many of their local, all these different sects, so they hired community members from those sects to bring them in. And I actually kind of turned them down, but I helped them find a curator from that local community, because I was saying, like, even myself, even as an Aboriginal person, going into that community, I'd be doing the same thing you'd be doing. If you at least get one of the local members, even if they haven't got curatorial experience, I can help them that bit. Their cousins will come, you know what I mean? And then, and that way the community gets introduced to the space. So you actually don't, yeah, so it definitely happens. More Aboriginal people in the space, more, when you see yourself in the space, it's easier to enter that space.
It's a great comment. Paul's asked a question, but I'm going to skip over it just for the moment because a few people have jumped in there, but we can come back to it if we have time. Sorry, I don't have a mouse and I'm using that horrible thing on my laptop, you know, and I'm all over the shop. So we'll come back to that, Paul, if we have time. Marie made a comment and Jelena made a comment. Margie, you talked about COVID-19 info dissemination and the tech-savvy seniors. Here's a question from Susanna to Oriana. Could you please comment on the widening digital inclusion gap for multicultural communities? Is it against the general trend for digital inclusion? Are there sort of more problems coming up there?
I think the disadvantaged communities are normally, we have the low income, and with that it's also the multilingual communities. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So it seems like the trend having changed, like the multicultural communities are a disadvantage. I wouldn't say there is a huge amount of wealthy people. And so that's where they are identified. Together with the indigenous people of Australia, with the original people, they are also the migrants and refugees. Why? Well, number one, tech-savvy senior is focused on aging communities. So we're looking at the people that are now 60 plus. None of those people were, I wasn't born with technology. The technology that I touched was in 1987 or later than that, 1980. And so there's a disadvantage. We don't think technology. And when your telephone or your laptop or whatever your children gave you as a gift, they didn't give you a gift because they didn't want it. It was already old, so it just died. And in order to replace that, you need $500. If you are in a pension, you don't have $500. That's why the libraries are such a fantastic place to go, because they go there, and many libraries now, even when you might not be able to take it home, in some cases, you can borrow not a laptop or telephone, but you can borrow a device that you can take home and use. If you go to the library, if you don't have technology at home, then you will have a Wi-Fi in the library. And the assistant to get into those local government, in the New South Wales government website.
We, sorry to interrupt here, but we just did some research with public libraries during the COVID close down, and they said that they thought some of the reason for the queues outside Centrelink were actually because the public libraries were closed and people couldn't get online and do a lot of their form filling out and applications and things. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think it ties in with what you're saying.
But yeah. I think you're right. It's a known, it's true that when a person goes to Centrelink and they have to fill up a form that has more than 5 pages, maybe 10, they actually send them to the library to be filled up. And now there are some other issues coming with COVID, so I'm on it. I'm asking.
Okay. So Marie sort of has a jokey question there, and you kind of answered it, Danny. At the risk of sounding paranoid, how do we hide our data? And you've kind of answered it, but there's a bigger question there, isn't it? Like, how much of our users' data can we use without being intrusive, snoopy, stalky, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it has to come down to that idea that we need to determine not so much what question we have about our data, but we need to determine how we can use our data in the first place. And so, if we think about learner success, and we think about, okay, well, if we define learner success as being able to search the database better, or being able to find a resource that they need with greater ease, then we don't really need to know their socioeconomic background. We don't really need to know some of this particularly creepy stuff like their Wi-Fi information, how they're moving through a particular space. What we do need to know, for example, is maybe we need to know the search terms that they use and how many steps they took in order to get to some place. We need to know some information about their existing knowledge levels. And a lot of these, existing knowledge levels, search terms they used, how many steps they took, those aren't actually captured very well in existing data warehouse databases. And so the question then for us is, once we actually figure out what success means for us, then how do we get the non-creepy data in order to actually help the learners? Because often we start from the wrong end. We often start with the idea that, oh, we have lots of data, therefore let's try and find out stuff. So what we should really be asking ourselves is, how do we help people? And therefore, what kind of data do we need to know in order to help people? And most often than not, what we're finding, especially in higher education, is that the data that teachers need to help their students is actually the non-creepy data. It's actually self-reported data about how they're tracking. It's about data which teachers actually, or their teaching team actually knows about the students already, but isn't currently captured in a particular way. And so I think that there's a risk there if you start with the what I have, and therefore what I want to know, as opposed to how I want to help people.
There's thanks, Danny. There's another question there from Trish. If I'm missing anyone's, just copy and repost it. But Danny, you mentioned that libraries have a lot of data that academics would love to get a handle on and would be useful for learning and privacy and ethics. We've sort of talked about that a little bit, sorry. Danny from Jelena, as we're digitally engaged, we leave digital footprints everywhere. The question is, how can we minimise? And I think that was sort of the essence of Marie's question earlier that I glossed over a bit.
Yeah, and some of this comes down to institutional or organisational policies, to really be the people. Librarians are typically amazing at protecting privacy and information security, and so it's kind of within our cultural remit to basically push for these things and to say things like, or no, we need to change our regulation in organizations so that we do protect our learners' data and make sure it's only used in a way. And so I think we have a very powerful role to play in kind of speaking up in terms of that. But in terms of how to protect our own digital footprint, and to go with Marie's question as well, I think it's around, earlier we had a presentation before about how students use social media and get their news. And one of the quotes from the student is, if it's free, then we are the product. And I think that's very, very true, especially in public systems out there. But in more private systems like institutions, organizations, I think it really is down to that the only thing we really can do is make sure that the privacy statements and those kind of things are watertight. There's not much, once a student signs on to something, once a library user signs on to a library, I think the organization has a lot of control over what they do with the user's information.
Thanks for that. Danny also put a link to his mind map there, which may disappear when the session disappears. So if you want to click on that now and bookmark it or something, feel free to do that. I'm going to go back to some questions that were from for Nathan and Oriana, and then we'll come back to Danny, because Danny, there's a heap there for you. So Paul's question, which has sort of been answered in some ways, but not completely, is, do you feel that the next step for the cultural protocols would be to implement them on a national level? I know we've got the ALIA LARK protocols and some other things that people have mentioned in the chat, but what do you think is the next step?
Well, not with the protocols I made, because the protocols I made were for a specific library, and I think that can be a bit of the issue with the ALIA protocols, which I think the ALIA protocols are still very much applicable, and they're very good, where a lot of people, very good starting point. The only issue is I think they haven't been disseminated quite so well. I know even just 2 years ago, I think I went to the New South Wales Public Libraries Conference, and me and Damien Webb from the State Library asked the audience how many people heard of the ALIA protocols, and it was about half the audience. So I think they're still applicable, but I think next steps may be something like and it sounds, from reading the comments, it sounds like ALIA and CALL are already doing stuff, but maybe potentially things like, if you haven't seen it, the museums have done, Terry Jenkins created what's called the First Peoples Roadmap. And that's more of like a step-to-step of what, a 10-year plan for museums. And it's basically like, in these 10 years, you should do these next steps. And for some museums, like the Australian Museum, we've done a few of them already. So we can focus on the other ones, but it's a 10-year plan. So maybe something like that on a sector level might be useful. Whereas I think the protocols I worked on are very good for the University of Sydney Library, but you can look at them and think what could be useful for your library if you're engaging in that space. But I don't think they're meant to be sort of a very, because again, like I'm working with a very specific idea of different communities that I'll be working with. There's First Nation communities are diverse as every other community, so different areas will have different needs. So I think you'll have to change your protocols to that needs and to that community, which I think requires a bit more work. Yeah. Thanks.
That's a really good point. I have to keep banging that into my head too. So did the tech savvies, Oriana, did the tech savvy seniors that you mentioned were left behind, did they ever have the opportunity to catch up again, or is this still an issue that's ongoing?
So what happened was, in the height of COVID, and fingers crossed they stay far away from us, libraries have to close. And the fundamental of the Tech Savvy Senior is a face-to-face program, where there's a lot of other things that are training online that you can find, and they are excellent programs. We really much focus on people who have never touched a computer. And so we lost them because the public library is closed. And now that things are kind of relaxed, we start working back with public libraries, and of course you have to promote, you need to inform them they are open for business, and so the community start coming back. So I will tell you that normally we would run a class with 10 people and we have a whole bunch of people waiting. This time you look at a class that it might be around 6, because some people left the library and it didn't come back. And they still haven't come back yet. So libraries start again working really hard, engaged, and say, yes, we are open. I mean, Fairfield has a beautiful library, just open, and people don't know. They will find out very soon. But yes, we are re-engaging. We are just coming toward the end of the financial year, and I'm pretty sure that the government is going to fund again the program. So we start again.
Yeah. Thanks, Oriana. So Jelena makes the point, I think, agreeing with Nathan, that that a cultural protocol needs to be implemented within a specific cultural context and relevant to the location and demographic. Thanks, Jelena. Now, let me see, there was another one here. Catherine. Learning analytics. Oh, it's like a comment. What happens as course coordinator when one sees data is at odds with what the students say they want and what the uni will fund them to do? I think all teachers have seen a bit of this. For example, recorded lectures, students say they want them over and over, but learning analytics show very low numbers actually watch them, let alone the whole thing. What do we go with the analytics or what they say, and how do we?
It's a really good question. Then Jelena's point actually is quite key to this, because it's context is king in analytics, and context is king. Therefore, the teachers actually understand the best, and that's what we're trying to work with at Sydney, at least. The teachers are convinced by data, and so are students, and so are management. And so, if you want to affect the influence the perception of management also for students, then show them correlations from the data that between lecture watches and captures, between performance, and show them that there is no correlation between that. And so I think use data in the right way for good. Yeah, on this kind of collecting data with student learning idea as well, I just want to copy and paste a paper that I found the other day, which is quite interesting. It's a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of different studies looking at the correlation between library instruction and library use and student GPA. And so it's very US-centric, but they essentially found very little support for the correlation between this between library instruction and usage and also student performance. But the problem here is that the GPA is super decontextualized. It's this one single number that summarizes a student's 36 months of work, and how on earth do you actually connect those two pieces of information together? You can't really. And so a lot of this research, I think, and especially in kind of the LARK context, it's really important for us as library researchers to be able to dig down into context and not miss the trees for the forests, if I can perturb that saying in the opposite way. Often with data, we see we see the forest, but we don't see the trees. It's really important to see the trees, I think.